talk a little bit about that. So earlier this week, I was having difficulty getting UV Master plugin to work in ZBrush, and it's because I was launching ZBrush without admin privileges. So the plugins were not actually loading, which is frustrating because they were there in the menu set. But let's take a look. So for those of you who don't know, Windows security has kind of tightened up over the last 5 years or so. So you have specific roles inside of your operating system. You're either loosely a guest or an admin. There are quite a few different sort of tiers to that hierarchy, right? Now what you want to be, especially on a PC that you are in complete control of, is admin, 100%, right? So the best thing to do for that, a lot of legacy CG software, I think, was developed at a time where admin privileges weren't so strict. So you had a lot of the software assumes that it has free reign of your operating system to a certain degree. But things like plugins and et cetera, this new admin privileges structure in Windows has just been a nightmare for me. I can understand it though, I'm not complaining. I do understand why things have gotten a little bit tighter, but it just makes it sort of that much more difficult to kind of operate third-party plugins and third-party extensions and things like that when you're working in software. What I'm used to is being able to not only work really, really quickly, but to go online super fast, grab a plugin that I need or a tool set that I need, install it within 5 minutes, and then continue working. That kind of workflow is not 100% available anymore, other than inside of Blender. Right? Okay, so one of the difficulties that we ran into last time was pertaining to sort of working with the UV Master. So I'm just going to do a quick sort of recap, and then we'll sort of build on this once we get inside of Maya. I will backpedal you guys to almost to cube level, and we'll talk a little bit about UV unwrapping inside of Maya. But just as a recap, so let's say we have a sphere, and if we take a look at the polyframe on the sphere, we've got a lot of geometry, and we're looking at UV unwrapping this, right? First of all, inside of ZBrush will not allow you to operate any plugin operations on a piece of 3D geometry unless it's been converted to a Polymesh 3D. Now, you will find this in a lot of software, right? A lot of 3D objects are considered parametric objects or uneditable objects until you convert them to a Polymesh 3D, or in the case of Max, an editable mesh, or in the case of Maya, just deleting history so it gets rid of the parametric node. There is one step that you have to take before you can sort of work on software, right? Work on geometry, and it's generally quite software specific. So let's pop in here and let's fire up our UV Master. So a good sort of workflow in terms of UV Master that they recommend is that immediately you make a clone. I never do this. I work directly on my parent object, right? But I just thought it might be sort of more prudent upon me to encourage you guys to click on work on clone, right? So it'll create a clone. Aha, already I know that my plugin is working because that worked properly. And you'll see it'll append capital CL underscore to your geometry to say, look, man, you're working on a clone, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to send that plugin over here so it's always open. And I can kind of see it a little bit better, right? So this is what I was talking about last class. This enable control painting, right? So you remember I talked to you guys about the concept of pelting and all this kind of stuff. Well, how do you arrange an object so that the pelting controls know where to make the cut and things like that, right? So that's what this control painting is about, right? So the control painting says that I can define an area that I want to protect. Let's say I want the front of this sphere perfect the way it is. No UV seams on it or anything, right? So I can paint that area in, and then I can flip over to attract and say, okay, look, if you're going to cut, right, I want you to cut along here, right? Now, it's not perfect. It's kind of like a suggestion. It's kind of like a magnet. What I mean by that is the algorithm in ZBrush that does the UV pelting will attempt to obey these conditions, but if it runs into trouble, it'll just jump to another area and make a cut, right? So, and that's part and parcel to make sure that the plugin is always operating. It doesn't error out, right? But this should be relatively simple enough, right? So if we come in here, right, we've created our control painting, right? We can click unwrap, and it should go through and make the cuts that we need, right? How's it going, kiddo? Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Okay, so how can we see what we've done here? Well, inside the UV Master plugin, we have this thing called Flatten, which will actually do the pelting operation for you. It'll take those cuts and it'll flatten your object out for you, right? So this is what we get, right? So it's cut along those areas that we defined inside of our painting, right? And then we can unflatten to come back, right? So that, in kind of essence, is the whole pelting sort of process. So let me switch back to just a regular tool. And if we were to take I'll just take a simple anime head here. Right. So if I come in through here, and we can take a checkerboard texture and apply that, right? And it needs UV coordinates. So I'm going to create a bunch of UV coordinates super quick, right? So there's our UV coordinates. Now, that looks awful, right? So, we need to do something about those UVs. Now, what does this mean again, right? This means that if we tried to paint a detailed skin pores on our character, the skin pores would go and look sucked into the face, right? So, yeah, it's like a sour warhead. So what we need to do is we need to sort of define, we need to unwrap this again, right? If I were to come in here and do a sudden flatten UVs, right, you can see that, oh, it can't really flatten it because there are no cuts or anything. So it's just taken the head and it's just squished it down flat, right? So that's not going to work for us. We need to be able to unwrap it so it lays completely flat. Where's the seam on the texture? There is no seam as of yet. So let's put one in, right? Now, we won't be able to see it, but I'll talk to you guys about that in a minute. So let's enable our control painting and get into protect, right? So I'm holding down the space bar and just changing the size of the brush, right? So we can say, look, don't do anything to the front of the face, right? We want that perfectly clean and even, right? And, you know, just super quick, paint that in. And we're going to say, look, if you're going to have to cut, here's where I want you to put the cut lines, right? Back here, along here, down the back. And so it'll try its best to kind of follow that line that we defined, or that, try to keep those cuts in those areas, right? Maybe I'll make the brush a bit smaller. Right? You know, something like that. We generally have to cut around the ear as well. Right? And I've got symmetry turned on, so I only have to draw on one side, right? Just for the sake of just making our lives easier, actually, put one in through here. That should do it, right? Okay. So now, with that control painting, right, we can unwrap, and it'll have a little bit of an easier time. Now, we can't see the seams on this, right? So this is one of the kind of disadvantages of this technique. It's a purge mask. Yeah, kind of. Ooh, it's taken a fair amount of time unwrapping this bad boy, but that's all right. Okay. So let's see what we're dealing with. Let's flatten this guy. There we go. So it's almost unrecognizable, but it has taken those cuts that we've sort of defined, and it's unfurled it just like an animal pelt and laid it out flat. Right? Now you can start to see some disadvantages of using UV Master. To be honest, I only use UV Master if I'm in a hurry and I need a general pelting operation. But I just thought I'd show you because we were on the topic of pelting yesterday. So I'm going to pop over to the texture map, turn my texture on. You can see we got even squares. They're not oriented the way we want, but it's looking better. So if we were to texture paint this, we would get no distortion on our texture at all. But it's not perfect, right? The squares are not perfect. It's just not perfect. Okay? Are you guys still receiving my signal? Just a shout out to the Twitch stream. My webcam isn't active because I was having difficulty getting that webcam operational. It's working on my Discord channel though. Okay, so let's duck out of ZBrush for a second now. Any questions about that, guys? Oh, I froze for 7 seconds. Can you guys hear me now? Is it all good? It's all okay. Cool. Let's soldier through. I have no reports of frame drops on my Twitch stream. So if you guys have missed anything, you can catch up on the Twitch stream. Should be okay, right? So let's pop open Maya and we'll take a look. So I had the opportunity to take a real quick look yesterday at the new UV toolkit, and it's pretty decent. I was able to pick it up reasonably quickly because I've been doing UVs for years. And I've been using a tool called Rism UV, which has the same kind of functionality. So it was just a matter of where is this button? In terms of understanding how the tool works, it wasn't difficult to wrap my head around. So that was good. So that means I can come and talk to you guys a little bit more comprehensively about UVs. So while I'm waiting for Maya to do its preload check, I'll talk a little bit about what I've used classically in the past. So classically, I have no idea why this is the case, but a lot of out-of-the-box software, from Exocide to 3D Studio Max to Maya, even ZBrush, have had god-awful UVing tools. They're just awful, right? So oftentimes, myself and my colleagues who are production artists, we would look for third-party solutions. And there are quite a few out there. You might have run across Roadkill, Hedis UV Layout. There's quite a few different ones or different flavors out there that are available, right? And my weapon of choice was Hedis UV Layout, simply because I could cut shells apart in a 3D view, and it was actually working on 3D shells, which I really sort of enjoyed. Oh, there's a question. What is the resolution of the texture you would suggest on face of that size in ZBrush? What is that dependent on? So a face that size inside of ZBrush, what would tell me what resolution I need to put that at? Yeah, you can figure out the answer if you think about it carefully. How many squares is shown? Depends on the camera, yes. But Tyrone said at that size in ZBrush, so at that camera angle. So let's call that a close-up, right? So with a close-up shot, what resolution do we make it? I'd be interested if you guys get the answer to this. 4K. Okay, why 4K? Why 4K? because you're right up close to the face. But why 4K? Why not 8K? Why not 32K? Why not 2K? What's wrong with 2K? 2K works. 2K is very detailed. Oh, I'm going to say that that's the right answer, Joe, because it's resource heavy. Yes. Yeah, so it's, graphics card dependent and stuff like that. But think about the detail. How are you looking at the detail of your character? How are you looking at it? Before you see your 3D model, from your eyes to your 3D model, there is something in between. Not the camera lens. There is something between you and your 3D model. You guys have stumped. Okay. Yes. Monitor and screen. I will put it to you this way. That face on the camera, right? What resolution would the texture need to be for that face on your telly? 4K? What if it's being broadcast on a movie screen? Is it still 4K? You still happy with 4K if it's being blasted onto a movie screen? $4K for a movie screen is too much? Too much? We're talking what, 12, 14 foot high screen by like a movie theater screen. The physical movie theater screen. Yeah, lots of people are typing. So that's why there are pauses in this Twitch stream. So let me just prep the scene whilst I'm waiting. Oh, I gotta fit everything into one screen space, don't I? Okay, let's see. Yeah, let's try that. There you go. It's probably the best visual detail without having all the risks of it being too much. No, I was thinking like in college. Told me stuff in theaters is on a lower resolution because it's further away. What? Who told you that? Oh my god! Stuff in the theater is on a lower resolution because it's further away? You were fed the wrong information, my son. Yeah, that's patently incorrect. So, but my point is being made, right? And this is the one thing that's a big frustration of something you have to consider as a digital artist. You have to think of your delivery medium. So not only when you're sitting down and creating a character, not only do you have to think about the camera shot, but you have to ultimately think of where is this getting beamed on? TV? And nowadays, what TV? HD? 4K? 8K? Right? Actually, I'm being a bit facetious because it's not the movie screen per se. Not really, because a movie screen doesn't have pixels, right? But the plate captured by a sort of like an Arri Red camera or a Sony Cinealta Venice camera, it's their sensor, right? So the sensor on the cinematic cameras They're 8K, but they're usually restricted to a 6K capture format on the back of the sensor. So really, your resolution will max out at 6K anyway, and then that's what's being broadcast onto the screen. So it's 6K being stretched across the movie screen. But as every cinematographer on the planet, every visual effects artist on the planet is fighting for more resolution, right? With a projector for a cinema screen, wouldn't it be independent on the projection resolution as well? Sort of. There used to be an issue with that, right? Now, back in the day with lenses, there used to be this whole idea of making sure the projectionist had the same set of lenses that the cinematography team had, right? Actually, I'm getting sidetracked by lenses. But yes, you're absolutely right. So a digital cinema projector needs to be accurately calibrated to replicate what the film crews have done on set and on location, right? So anyway, the point of it is, whether you're designing for a gaming experience on an HD TV or you're doing visual effects for an Avengers shot, that's what dictates what resolution you're going to be at. Right? Now, it becomes difficult as a student because we don't have that. So our decisions are quite arbitrary, right? Our decisions actually might relate more to what Joe said originally. We are driven by resources and how much will slow our PC down. So we might want to create an imaginary character for an imaginary movie project and bring in 32K textures, but our little Dell laptop at home might slow to a crawl and ultimately blue screen and die, right? So with you guys, the detail level you put into your models is up to you. Your texture resolution is up to you to a certain degree. Because I say to a certain degree because most of us are designing for 1920 by 1080 HD, right? So we want to kind of stick to about 2K textures. Okay, wow. Wildly sidetracked, as per usual. You guys always do this to me. 8K for everything. Yeah. Nah, that's a true artist thinking there. Okay. My media life has been a lie. Not necessarily. Tom, a lot of the stuff that you told me about what you learned in media class sort of makes sense to me, and I can see the perspective from where they're coming from. But the resolution thing, that shocked me a little bit. And as an artist, you should be constantly striving for more detail, more realism within technical boundaries. Gone are the days of the low poly modeler. Gone, right? It's now just called the optimization process at the end, right? Nobody really starts off low poly modeling. Not really. Not when you hit a certain level, right? Okay, so yes, no more asking questions. So I'm inside the UV texture editor. Now there's a few different things we want to do. We want to sort of, we want to UV our sphere. Now you can see that by default, the sphere already comes with a cut line. Maya's kind enough to provide these parametric objects that already have UV coordinates. And you can see what I just discussed last class about the concertina, right? But let me turn this off because default it comes this way, right? So here are our UVs. Let me turn these guys off as well. Sorry, that one. So this is generally what we're looking at UVs. Now there are a few things in the UV editor that will help you kind of make sense of these things. One of the things that I pretty much turn on straight away is the UV shell coloring. Because again, the it's a visual warning system, right? Well, I'll tell you what. First I'll turn on the checkerboard so we can see what we're doing. So the UV editor is kindly included. Maya has kindly included a checkerboard pattern for us, right? And it's a decent one because it comes labeled with our UV coordinates. I'll talk a little bit about these in a minute, right? But you can see we've got stretching and distortion and some weird sort of things going on, right? So if we were to take a look at our seam, we'll see some interesting things, right? So for me to be able to find that seam, I need to turn on my UV border shell. So that's one of the second things that I turn on. So the first thing I turn on is the shell coloring. The second is the UV borders. So what that means is I can go and, quite easily find my UV border, right? Now notice well, it's kind of hard to tell here actually because the checkerboard lines up. But what ends up happening along the UV border is if you don't match that texture up perfectly across the border, you'll see like a split in the texture and it'll look really, really strange, right? So it's really kind of important that we're aware of where that UV split is, right? So those two things are sort of essential inside of the UV texture editor to turn on, right? So the coloring of the shells and the UV border, so we can see the border of that shell. Now, I've said the term UV shell a couple of times. What I'm talking about is the fact that when you cut pieces out of a character, you're actually creating these self-contained shells. That becomes important a little bit later on because you can organize yourself a little bit by understanding that you have not only UV points, but you can create these UV shells, or just pieces, really. So let me right-click and go into UVs, and I'll select the UVs. Maya lets you know that you've selected UVs by coloring it differently than a vertex selection. So if I come in here and I scale these inside out, is it going to let me? It's not going to let me. Oh, there. I'm going to have to do it this way. I'm just going to grab these guys and then perhaps move them over. There we go. Okay. So it's not letting me flip the UVs inside out using an old school technique. But we'll talk a little bit about this. So I've got the checkerboard pattern turned on, one thing, right? And it's super bright. It's really hard to see, isn't it? So we can actually come in here and we can dim down our texture. And we've got a slider to control how dim that we go, right? Because sometimes we still want to see our texture in the background so we know what we're doing. We know where we're placing things. Remember when I showed you in ZBrush we did the pelt mapping and then it ended up like this blob and we don't really know what we're looking at or where the seams are? So Maya comes with some built-in tools that help us out. But also, notice that the shell goes pink, or let's see if I can get a pure, or red, when those normals are inverted. They're facing the wrong way. So basically it's saying, like I said for the cube lesson, it's trying to warn you and say, you know, those normals are facing inside out, and what that means is that, well, it just means that everything in the red shell will be backwards. So you'd see the U1, V1 backwards, right? And so you don't want to do that, right? Those are inverted UVs. It's saying that you are working with the inside of the object, not the outside, right? Okay, so let's come in here and figure out what we want to do. So we want to set this up so we've got a little bit of a different kind of look to, I'm just trying to think which we say we're texturing. Well, I'll just cut this up so we make a better texture now, right? So I'm going to turn off the shells, and I'm going to right click and go back into my object mode. Okay, whoops, turn off the checkerboard, right? So over here is our UV toolkit, right? So the UV toolkit comes with, it's nothing new actually, it comes with a lot of the traditional tools that I'm used to working with. It's just collected them together in sort of a handy place over here. So I'll walk you through some of the more kind of simpler tools that I like working with, right? So first of all, let's go into the Create panel. So oftentimes inside the Create panel, what a CG artist will do when laying out their UVs for the first time, they might go through and zap a few very, very simple pre-built projections onto their object. You know, I could say, give it a spherical projection, which will just give me this. Or I can say, give it cylindrical. So for example, say we got a character and we want to kind of do the arms. Well, instead of cutting and moving and pelting and doing all kinds of stuff in the arm, you could select just the top part of the arm and say, look, give me a basic cylindrical map, right? So what Maya will do is it'll create this invisible cylinder and then seam that cylinder and unwrap it for you, right? So you get a really, really quick general sense of that arm. You got planar projections. You can do a camera-based projection, meaning everything that I see in the camera viewport, say from that edge loop to that edge loop, take that and unwrap it for me, right? So there's a few different basic unwrapping techniques that are available for here to give you sort of a starting point, right? But let's go in and make some cuts, right? So under here we can cut and sew and sort of define what we want for our shells, right? So I'm going to grab the cut tool. I want to make sure I'm in edge mode, right? And with that cut tool selected, if I double click on a line, it gives me an edge loop. Let's go up a little bit higher. I'm going to double click around here, right? And then if I click on the cut tool, oh, actually, you know what? Let's back up a step. I just realized we've got big, strong border lines on all of our UVs, and what that means is that if I were to come in here and grab my UVs, let's go here. I'm going to grab the UV shell. Just want to check this out. Yeah, they're already cut. They're all cut into individual squares. We don't want that. So here's what we'll do instead. I'm going to go back to object mode, and we'll give it a new projection, right? So I'm going to say, okay, give me just a quick planar projection, right? So here's what Maya does when it gives you a planar projection. It says, look, I'm just hitting it from one side, just flat. It's kind of like taking that Christmas wrapping paper metaphor and just going, pushing it onto the sphere, right? It hasn't got the whole sphere. But it also gives you this little gizmo, right, that you can size to say exactly where you want to put that that projection, right? And then when we come in here, we can see that we've got let's turn on our UV borders and see if we can grab that shell. Shell. No, it's done the whole thing. It's just marked that as the UV projection space and projected straight through. That's okay, because we want to eventually come in here and just cut this object up ourselves, right? So I've got this. I'm going to come back into the cut tool, right? And I'm going to make sure I'm in edge mode and double click this guy, right? And then I can cut that. Haha, I see what happened. Cut. Man, I'm doing this backwards. So we want the cut tool to specify the edge loop around. Sorry guys. Now we want to cut, right? So it's now just cutting along that demarcation line that we picked. I was like, why is this not working? And it's because I'm doing it backwards. Oh my God, himbo moment. All right, so that means I've got this as a separate shell, right? So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to come in here to my UVs. I'm going to grab, come in here, right click, select UVs, pick that UV, and then right click or shift right click to UV shell, right? And I'm going to hit W to get my transform tool, and I'm going to move this out, right? So that's what that means. I have just now cut the top out and separated that as an object, right? It doesn't do us any good at the moment, but you'll see. Just hold tight. Okay, but I know that a planar projection or a piece of Christmas wrapping paper, again, would fit perfectly on that. I could cut it out and it would just look fine, right? So let's take our cut tool and let's remember to go into edge loops and then double click and cut there. Now it's going to stop whenever it hits a point where the edge loops can no longer continue. So what that means is we've hit this high valence vertex and the edge loop doesn't know where to go. So it's stopped. This is kind of important because as you cut up your model, you'll grab edge loops, and sometimes the edge loops will loop all the way around your object unexpectedly, or sometimes they'll stop in places where the edges can't continue, right? But that's fine. I'm going to now cut that, and you can see that that line thickens out as well. So you can see why I've turned these on. Very, very helpful for keeping track of where your seams are. So I'm just cutting this object out, right? Cutting with the cut tool, and then saying cut, right? Now, inside the UV menu, they've got this 3D cut and sew UV tool, which is kind of cool. Don't need to go here. You can do all your work inside the UV toolkit, but this is quite cool. It means that I can just double click here and it'll do it for me, right? It'll loop and cut for me. So that's kind of cool, but I recommend that more if you know what you're doing. Over here, this allows you to just cut, control your cut, and then let's do it. This way, I can select it. You can see it highlighted in red, and then you can decide, I want to change my mind or whatever. So changing your mind, you hold down Control, and you can double click, and it'll just eliminate that. Or I can double click this, right? And I can Control single click just to remove one at a time, right? So you can really sort of dictate how you want this line to go. I can shift click and add to my cut again, just to bring that back around, and then just cut, right? So I've made another band through there, and then I'll just make another cut through here, and it's gone all the way through. You can see that I'm constantly checking my 3D object, and I'm going to cut it through there. Now, notice what Maya's doing with the shells turned on, right? It's giving me unique shell coloring, which is really cool, right? It's a new feature, and I'm like, wow, that's awesome. I wish I had this back in the day. But it lets you keep track of what shells you've got going on. Now, you can turn that on by right-clicking as opposed to left-clicking on here, right? So when I right-click on here, it'll give me that. If I left-click, it'll give me just blue on one side, red on the other, right? So I can switch back and forth. So it's telling me, oh, okay, well, my UV coordinates are inverted over here, so I'm going to have to come back and figure out what to do with that. I'm going to right-click on this to give me unique shell colors, right? But it's still like a sphere, right? It's got overlapping UVs. It's just really problematic. So how do we deal with this? So after we create our projections and we cut and sew, you can see that Maya's organized this in terms of workflow, going from top to bottom. I can go down to my next set of menus, unfold, right? You don't have to know any of these. You just need to know the unfold button. So it'll go through. And I have to select the shells that I want unfolded, right? So I'm going to come in here and select all these guys. Now unfold, right? And it'll go through and boom, unfolds it all for you, right? So if I come back and turn on my checkerboard, you can see I got a little bit more of an even distribution across here, right? And let's turn off our shell coloring for a second. I'll go back to this, right? So that means we will have kind of undistorted textures, right? But here's what I'm talking about with the seams, right? You can see where the seam breaks are. It just doesn't seem evenly continuous across that line. That's why where you put your seams is a very important consideration. But why I also say that it's not a massive consideration in this day and age, because with 3D painting applications, I can just paint what I want across there, right? But it's still, a good idea to keep your UV borders in mind, right? So I'm going to turn back on my shell coloring, right-click that. Now, there's something that I'd like to do here, and that is to lay out my UVs, because they're a little bit all over the place. Now, this is also important, because one of the things that we really look at when looking at show reels and things like that for hiring artists, especially if you're a texture artist or a junior modeler who might be involved with UVing in a smaller studio, is how you pack your texture pages. Remember, the PC has to load and calculate this entire texture square, and it's calculating all this empty space, right? So the more you can pack into a texture page, the more optimized it is. Now, the feature film guys don't have to worry about this as much per se, Actually, that used to be back in the day, but I'm going to walk back that statement because I think a lot of feature film and TV guys are now very, very concerned about texture packing, just because the demands on rendering pipelines are so huge now. There's a lot of game-specific optimizations that are creeping into film and television, right? And one of those is making sure we don't have any wasted texture space on our texture page, right? But what I want to do is I want to lay these out quite a little bit nicer, right? So if I come to this unfold button and I hold shift and left click, it'll give me options, right? So I can really sort of adjust how that unfold works, right? Which is a bit strange. I wish they put the Maya checkerboard here, that checkerboard button that you're used to seeing everywhere else to open up options, or not checkerboard rather, but if we come over here, just that square to open up options. But there you go. They decided to nest it in a hotkey. Now, oh, I did have layout UVs turned on. Okay, let me apply this, and I'm going to, just to show you, right? So I'm going to select all these shells. Perhaps because I'm still in UVs. I'm going to select all those guys, right? And I'm going to unfold. It's already done the operation. It's not going to do the operation again. What I was trying to show you is that when you click out Layout UVs, what the unwrap utility tries to do is tries to pack the page for you very efficiently. So I guess it's done that. Maybe we just don't have enough pieces to make it worth its while, right? But generally the layout will try to kind of maximize the space. It's going to take a look at arrange and layout down here, because then we have a few other functions that might be able to help. I'm hoping the Oriat shells is very similar to what I was used to before. No, it's not doing. So what Oriat shells used to do is to turn it so they were all facing in similar directions, so you get a nice even distribution of squares. But that's not doing that. That's okay. I'm going to go back to just the straightforward unfold. And then I'm going to click on optimize, right? Actually, there won't be anything to really optimize because these shells have been laid out quite optimally. Right? Okay, so the other thing I wanted to sort of show you is what happens if you have, let's take this guy. I'm going to come over here, grab that UV, shift, or control, right click, to UV shell, right? So I got this UV shell here. I think I got two of them. Yes, I do. Right. I move these up here. There's a few things I want to show you. First of all, let's take. Oh, let's turn off. Let me turn off my symmetry for a second. Okay. I'm gonna bring these guys closer together. Right. Okay, so the one thing that's helpful inside a UV texture editor, if I come in here and I go into edge loop mode and I select these edges here, what it'll show me is the corresponding edges that they are connected to. This is really helpful because you can easily get lost into thinking that this is a separate edge loop from this one, right? So the UV editor will always show you what it's connected to, right? So if I select on this edge, I can zoom out and sort of find where it's connected to. I can just move this quick and then undo it. Oh yeah, it's connected down here, right? So you can always see that where when you're laying out your pattern, where it's all going to connect up. Right? But the other thing I wanted to show you is to come in here when I grab these UVs, right? If I were to suddenly scale these up, or actually, let's go out the other way. Scale it down, right? Now we have what are called bad texel ratio, right? And I went through this last class as well in terms of matching up those squares and making them look even, right? So we got awful texel ratio here, right? Now we can go in here like I used to do back in the day, and then just sort of eyeball it. I'd be like, yeah, okay, that's good enough, right? And I'd be happy with that. But what if it needed to be perfect, right? This is cool. This is my favorite addition. You know, when I saw this yesterday, I was like, oh my God, that's so cool, right? So inside the UV toolkit, I knew I should have dove into this a lot sooner. If we go under the transform menu, down at the bottom of the transform menu is a texel density utility. Well, what does this do? Well, it means that I can come over here and select these guys, right? And get the texel density, right? Based on the map size. So let's say it's a 1024 by 1024 map. Now, if I were to go, say, 2048 by 2048 and get this again, you'll see the number alters, right? So this will let me know what the texel density is for that. Here's where it gets cool. I can select this guy and say set. And it will size up that shell to a perfect match to everything else. This is a dream utility, right? So if you're worried about your texel ratios matching, this is a wonderful tool to make sure that all of, I would actually recommend it, even though it's nested and transformed sort of out of the way, as one of the final steps for you guys. When you're cutting and sewing shells, make sure that you do this as a final step to set your texel density. So what would I use as my primary texel density to get? Well, say we're unwrapping the face. I would set carefully the resolution of the front of the face for obvious reasons. It's your character, right? And that I would set as the texel density to dictate to all the other pieces what size they should be, right? If that makes sense. Right? So, that's really cool. I haven't done an in-depth exploration of the UV toolkit as of yet, but those are my favorite tools. And I can see myself using these bread and butter in terms of unwrapping, right? So I use the sphere just as a basic introduction to this tool. I will be taking a look at a little bit more of a complex object and walking you through my process of UV unwrapping it in just a minute, right? So if you use other tools like Rism UV or Hedis UV Layout or Roadkill or that kind of thing, they will have Unfold, they'll have Optimize, they'll have quite a few other tools available for you. Align and Snap, I don't really bother with. They're sort of tweaking, right? So it's just kind of this idea of, well, how do I want to lay my shells out? Back in the day, I'd have to do this sort of control right-click to shell, and then I'd rotate this guy carefully, and I'd lay out my pages carefully. There's just some tools that automate it. So for example, I can say, you know what, in my UV page, can you snap up to the top, right? And I can grab this guy, and, snap this to the bottom corner, that sort of a thing, right? So it's just some tools that will allow you to snap things together, stack the tools, etc., etc. Arrange and layout. More about making sure that your shells are sort of laid out. Oh, here we go. There's the, other than the orient shells. So if we grab these guys and layout, there we go. So it'll pack your texture page for you with your shell orientations and make sure that everything's in place. The final thing that I'm going to hit on is all this space in the UV texture editor. We've got all this texture space, right? So something that you guys don't know is that the 0 to 1 texture space is where you do your texturing in the beginning. All game models texture, used to, they don't anymore, but I'll talk about it, right? So basically the 0 to 1 texture space is a great place to pack all of your texture shells when you start out. Because the only thing that happens in UV space out here is that this texture gets repeated ad infinitum. It's tiled, up, down, left, right, off into infinity. So it's the same texture over and over and over again. So if I sort of had a building texture with grass down here, and then you know, the roof up here, right? And then if I come in here and I move this up here, my roof piece would suddenly get grass texture. Right? So it's tiling ad infinitum, right? But there's this technique called multi-texturing, or multiple UVs, which allows me to use these quadrants, but then I have to go in and connect up an extra UV coordinate node to say, look, at this location, there's a different texture there. That's much more of an advanced texturing technique, which I will get into later. But for now, stay inside the 0 to 1 UV space here to there. You just want to texture or UV unwrap your pieces in there. Now, when that's all said and done, I can get out of here, I can bring this into a painting package, and I can paint now on this to my heart's content, because I know that all the UV shells have been laid out. I have cut the pattern for the Christmas wrapping paper that will eventually go on my object. I don't have to think about it anymore. I can just work on the design of the texture, right? So that's the process in a nutshell. You know, there are a few other smaller things that you need to do in that journey along the way, but that is a general overview of UV unwrapping. Any questions? Any questions? Do you guys follow along okay? All good? Nope, that's cool. Okay, I'm going to stop this stream, and we'll take like a couple of minutes comfort break, and I'll come back. And when I come back, we'll dive into a little bit more of a complex object.